Ireland is small on the map, but your DNA doesn't see it that way. Because inside this one island, inside a place people casually call Irish like it's one single thing, there are invisible lines. Not political borders. Not county lines you can point at with your finger. Genetic lines, shaped by distance, coastlines, mountains, old sea routes, raids, migrations, and generations of families who stayed put. And here's the part that surprises most people. Some of the biggest DNA differences you'll ever see aren't between Ireland and Britain, or Ireland and Europe. They're within Ireland itself, between North and South, between the Atlantic West and the more connected East and Southeast, and even between neighboring counties that spent centuries living like separate worlds. So if you've ever taken a DNA test and wondered why you got Scottish when your family swears you're Irish, or why your cousin's results look different even though you share the same grandparents, or why one part of Ireland seems to show up more strongly than another, this video is going to make it make sense. But first, one important warning, so nobody mishears what this story is saying. When we talk about DNA differences, we're not talking about pure types of people. There isn't a North Irish DNA that is totally separate from South Irish DNA, like different species. Real human genetics doesn't work like that. What researchers actually see are overlapping clusters and gradients. Think of it like accents. Accents change as you travel. They blend. They overlap. But you can still hear patterns. You can still tell that a place has a voice shaped by history. Irish DNA has a voice like that. So today, we're going to walk through why the North often looks a bit different from the South, why the West can have its own distinct signature in pockets, why coastal areas don't always match inland areas, and why modern DNA tests sometimes label Irish ancestry in ways that feel confusing. And by the end, you'll understand the biggest idea of all. Irish DNA is not one story. It's a stack of stories, layered on top of each other, written by movement and by staying still. Let's start by defining what we mean when we say North, South, and West. For the North, people usually mean Ulster, especially the northeastern part of the island. When we talk about the South, we're usually talking about Munster and much of Leinster. And for the West, we mean Connacht and the Atlantic-facing coast, places where the ocean is not just a view, but a wall and a highway at the same time. But remember, these are not hard lines. Ireland is not a chessboard. Genetics doesn't flip from one thing to another the moment you cross an invisible boundary. It changes gradually. That gradual change is one of the most important concepts in population genetics, and it's called isolation by distance. Here's what that means in normal human language. For most of history, people married people who lived near them. Not because they were trapped, but because travel was slower, harder, and more expensive. So your ancestors likely chose partners within a certain radius, often within the same region, sometimes within the same county, sometimes within the same set of neighboring counties. Over hundreds of years, that creates a pattern. People who live close tend to share more DNA, and people farther away tend to share a little less. It's not because they're unrelated. It's because the mixing happens more locally. Now add Ireland's geography and history, and you start to see why internal differences can become noticeable. Ireland is a place of peninsulas, bays, rivers, and mountain ranges. It has regions that were historically more connected to outside traffic, and regions that were historically more isolated. It has coastlines where ships came and went, sometimes for trade, sometimes for raiding, sometimes for colonization. And it has political and social events that pushed people into certain patterns of movement, settlement, and separation. So when researchers look at Irish DNA, they often see clusters that broadly line up with geography. They see that Irish people are genetically very close overall, but still show internal structure. And the North is often where people see the strongest difference. Why? Because the North, especially northeastern Ulster, has had centuries of strong connections across the narrow stretch of water to western Scotland. That sea is not a barrier. Historically, it was a bridge. People moved back and forth in both directions. Families crossed. Armies crossed. Traders crossed. And later, organized settlement movements shaped the region too. So genetically, many parts of Ulster can show a bit more similarity to Scotland and northern Britain compared to parts of the south and far west. Now, to be crystal clear, that does not mean Ulster isn't Irish. That's a misunderstanding people fall into when they treat DNA like a purity test. All it means is that Ulster's ancestry mix, on average, has a slightly different balance of historical inputs compared to other regions. Think of Ireland as a stew. It's all stew. But different areas got slightly different ingredients added at different times. A region can still be deeply Irish while showing a stronger signal of certain historical connections. And in Ulster, those connections are not random. They have names. They have time periods. And they have consequences. If you go back far enough, you get waves of settlement that shaped the whole island, ancient farmers, later movements, and the long blending of people over time. But for the regional differences people talk about today, one of the most influential eras is the last 1,000 years. First, there were the Norse, often simplified as Vikings. They didn't just raid. They also settled. They built towns. They opened trade routes. And while their genetic impact varies by region, coastal and urban centers can show traces of that movement. Then there were later medieval and early modern movements that affected different regions differently. And in the north, one of the major shaping events was the plantation era, when large numbers of settlers, especially from Scotland and England, arrived and established communities. Now, here's something most people don't understand about genetics. Even if you have a big migration event, it doesn't mean everyone in a region becomes genetically identical. It depends on how people married, whether communities stayed socially separated or intermarried, whether families moved around afterward, and how many people were involved compared to the existing population. But over time, these events can leave signals, especially in places where communities remained relatively stable. That's why many DNA studies, and even consumer DNA tests, often pick up something different in the north compared to the south and west. This is also why people from Ulster sometimes see more Scottish show up on consumer tests, even if their family history is Irish for as far back as anyone can remember. And that brings us to an important point: consumer DNA categories are not perfect mirrors of history. They're labels. When a test says Scottish, it doesn't mean a little Scottish flag is planted in your DNA. It means your genetic patterns match the company's reference samples labeled Scottish more than they match some other labeled group. And because Irish and Scottish populations have been connected for a long time, there's overlap. A lot of overlap. So if your family is from the north, and your test shows Scottish, that may not be a shock at all. It may actually be the test picking up a real historical pattern, just described with a modern label. Now what about the south? Southern Ireland has its own story, and in some ways it's the story of a crossroads. Not because the south was more foreign, but because certain areas, especially parts of the east and south, were historically more connected through trade routes, towns, and later urban growth. When populations are more connected and people move more, genetic differences can soften over time. Cities bring people together. Ports bring people together. Road networks and economic hubs bring people together. So in many parts of the south and east, you can see a pattern that looks like broader mixing, especially compared to some of the more isolated pockets along the Atlantic edges. But even there, it's not one uniform thing. Munster is not identical to Leinster, and coastal areas don't always match inland areas. History didn't paint with a single brush. The south also contains some of Ireland's most famous ancient and medieval centres, and those centres pulled people in. And then, in later centuries, internal movement changed the landscape even more. This is another reason modern DNA tests can be confusing. Because your DNA doesn't only reflect where your great-great-grandparents lived. It reflects where all of your ancestors lived, over many lines, for many generations. So you might have one branch deeply rooted in Kerry, another branch from Ulster, another branch that moved through Dublin, and another branch that came in from elsewhere. Your overall DNA is a blend of all of it. So sometimes when people ask, what's the DNA of the South, the better question is, which part of the South, and in what time period? Now let's talk about the West, because this is where the story gets poetic, and where a lot of myths are born. People love to romanticize the west of Ireland as the real Ireland. The place where ancient identity survived untouched. That's not how genetics works either. But the West does have something real going on. Isolation pockets. The Atlantic coast has regions that historically were less connected to the main flow of movement across the island. Not because nobody ever traveled, but because geography can create friction. Peninsulas, rugged coastlines, and smaller rural communities can produce a kind of genetic continuity, especially if families stayed in the same general area for centuries. And in genetics, continuity often shows up as stronger local clustering. It can show up as what researchers call founder effects, where a smaller population, over time, carries certain genetic patterns more strongly because there were fewer outsider inputs. This doesn't mean the West never had outside contact. Coastal contact was real, and the ocean is a highway. But contact doesn't automatically equal large-scale mixing. Sometimes, outside contact means a few traders. Sometimes it means a few families. Sometimes it means a short period of influence. And sometimes it means a deep, lasting impact. And it differs by place. Another crucial point, the West is not one single genetic unit. Donegal in the northwest has a different story than Galway and Mayo. Kerry in the southwest has its own patterns. The islands off the coast can have their own micro-stories. Even within a single county, one area can be more connected and another can be more isolated. So when people say, the West has a unique DNA, the responsible way to say it is. Parts of the West can show stronger signals of local continuity, and in some studies, certain Western regions appear as distinct clusters relative to other parts of Ireland. That's it. That's the truth. Anything beyond that becomes mythology. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, okay, so the North can lean a bit more Scotland-linked, the South can look more mixed in some areas, the West can have pockets of continuity, how does that show up in real DNA tests? Let's make this practical. Consumer DNA tests generally do two things. First, they estimate your ancestry by comparing your DNA to their reference populations. That's where you see percentage labels. Second, they identify relatives and shared segments, which can help you connect to regions through actual family matches. The percentage labels are where most confusion happens. Because Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and parts of English ancestry can overlap genetically. The populations are close, and the history is connected. So if your test says you're 40% Irish and 20% Scottish, it might not mean you had one Irish grandparent and one Scottish grandparent. It might mean your ancestry sits in that Irish-Scottish overlap zone that tests struggle to separate cleanly. And yes, this gets stronger in the North. But it can happen anywhere. Another reason people get confused is that siblings can get different estimates. That's not the test, lying. That's inheritance. You and your sibling don't inherit identical halves of your parents' DNA. You inherit different mixes. Over large segments, you're close, but not identical. So one sibling might inherit a cluster of DNA segments that look more like the company's Scottish reference, while another sibling inherits segments that the company labels Irish. Your family history is the same. Your DNA segments differ. Now here's the deeper, more interesting layer, the timeline. Because when we talk about regional Irish differences, we're often talking about multiple time periods stacked together. Think of it like a building with layers. At the bottom, there are ancient layers that most Irish people share, deep ancestry from far back in time. On top of that, there are medieval layers, Viking-era movement, sea routes, settlement patterns, regional power centers. Then there are early modern layers. Organized settlements and migrations that affected some regions dramatically more than others, especially in the north. And then there are modern layers, industrialization, urbanization, internal migration, famine-era migration, and movement in and out of cities. All of this shapes the genetic map. So when you see a difference between North and South, you're not looking at one single event. You're looking at a blend of events, and the North may have a different blend compared to the South. And when you see pockets of stronger local clustering in the West, you might be seeing the effect of smaller communities and less movement over long periods. Now, let's do a quick myth-busting moment, because this topic can easily go wrong if people bring the wrong mindset to it. Myth number 1, North Irish DNA isn't Irish. False. Irish identity is not a blood test. Genetics shows ancestry patterns, not cultural belonging. The North is part of Ireland's genetic landscape, and the differences you see are differences in historical inputs, not a different species of human. Myth number 2, the West is the only real Irish DNA. Also false. The West may show strong local continuity in some places, but all regions of Ireland have deep roots. Ireland is not one pure core and a bunch of diluted edges. That's not how real populations work. Myth number 3, DNA proves who you are. No. DNA informs where your ancestors likely came from and how populations moved. But identity is culture, language, community, history, and personal story, things DNA can't define. So what does this mean for you personally? If your family is from the North, and your DNA test shows more Scottish or Northern British signals than you expected, don't panic. That's a common pattern, and it fits Ireland's real history of movement across the North Channel and later settlement dynamics. If your family is from the South or East, and your results look more mixed across Irish and neighboring categories, that can reflect the reality of regional connections and later movement through towns and cities. If your family is from the West, especially rural areas or island communities, and your results show strong regional clustering or a heavy Irish label, that can reflect long continuity and localized marriage patterns. But always remember, every family is different. Your genealogy matters. The best way to make DNA tests truly meaningful is to combine them with real family information, which county, which townland, which parish, and whether your ancestors moved to cities like Dublin, Cork, Belfast, or emigrated and married into different communities abroad. Because the truth is, your DNA is not only Ireland. It's your family's version of Ireland. And that brings us back to the main idea of this video. Ireland isn't genetically uniform. It's a landscape shaped by distance and history. The North carries signals of deep connections across the sea. The South reflects its role as a connected heartland and crossroads in many areas. And the West contains pockets where geography and continuity left a stronger local signature. That's not a contradiction. That's what you should expect when you look at an island with thousands of years of human movement, settlement, and story. So here's my question for you. Which part of Ireland is your family from, North, South, or West? And what surprised you most when you saw your DNA results? Drop it in the comments, because I want to see how your personal story lines up with the bigger patterns we just talked about. And if you want the next video in this series, where we compare Ireland and Scotland DNA and explain why tests mix them up so often, subscribe right now, and I'll see you in the next one.